So I've spoken in the past about some of the major upsets I've seen in boxing, like Mike Tyson losing to Buster Douglas, like Tyson losing to Holyfield, etc. And somebody on Facebook asked me, which was the last fight I saw which truly shocked me, like the last upset? Because the upsets which have happened in recent times haven't really shocked me. AJ Ruiz did not shock me. I made pre-fight videos talking about how Ruiz is dangerous and Ruiz winning wouldn't shock me. I said the same about Jarrell Miller. Remember that? Most people were telling me I was crazy. When Miller was the original opponent for AJ in New York, I was saying, listen, I think Miller's dangerous. If he can take AJ's power, I think AJ's in for a very rough night. So AJ losing, and I also did that video about the guy from Forbes who predicted that AJ would lose in 2019. And I said, again, it wouldn't shock me at all. So it has been a long time since an upset truly shocked me. I guess I wasn't expecting Pacquiao to beat Keith Thurman, truth be told. For me personally, that surprised me more than any other result in a big fight in 2019. But in terms of a true shock, like on the level of a Tyson Douglas or Tyson Holyfield, the last time I was really shocked was when Roy Jones Jr. was knocked out by Antonio Tarver in 2 rounds. Now, to a lot of newer boxing fans, they won't really understand the significance of that fight. And a lot of newer boxing fans don't understand who Roy Jones Jr. used to be. They just know him as this washed up old guy who does, who was doing commentary for HBO for years and stuff like that, and fighting on way past his prime, always getting knocked out, looking chinny. Well, in the 1990s, Roy Jones Jr. was a phenom. I had never in my life, and I still haven't seen a fighter who was as athletically gifted as Roy Jones Jr. The stuff that he could do in a boxing ring was mind-blowing. He was like Neo from the Matrix. I mean, it was crazy watching a prime Roy Jones. He just made, tremendous fighters look totally ordinary. And I'm talking about Hall of Fame fighters. He made them look ordinary. He beat people like Hopkins, James Toney, Virgil Hill, Mike McCallum. He went up to heavyweight. I mean, this is a guy who boxed as low as 154. He went up to heavyweight and won the WBA heavyweight title. So Roy Jones was more than a boxer. He was like a phenom. And I was a huge fan of Roy Jones. Huge fan of Mike Tyson as well. Now, when Mike Tyson lost to Buster Douglas, I couldn't really comprehend what had happened. That was the first time that I really believed the fighter was invincible, because everybody believed Tyson was invincible. It wasn't just me. Everybody believed it. I mean, I'm sure there were some fighters out there who didn't believe it, but, the public, we all believed Tyson was invincible. It was just a thing in popular culture, like Mike Tyson can't lose a fight. He's the baddest man on the planet. So when he did lose, it was surreal. It was almost like it didn't happen. And people were making up all these excuses for Tyson and long counts and him not being in shape, and was he sick or was he drugged? And there was all kinds of stuff. People just couldn't accept it. I couldn't accept it because we had bought into this myth that there was such a thing as an invincible fighter. So when you truly believe a fighter is invincible, what happens when they lose? Like it just turns your whole world upside down. So it happened once with Mike Tyson in 1990. And then 6 years later on November 9th, it happened again. Mike Tyson had managed to build up his aura of invincibility all over again after he came out of prison. And there were people saying that Mike Tyson was better. This is what they were saying, I remember reading Ring Magazine and KO Magazine. They were doing all these Mike Tyson specials and Boxing Illustrated. Mike Tyson mania was in full swing when he came out of prison. He knocked out McNeely, fought Buster Mathis, knocked out Bruno. And particularly when he knocked out Bruno, it's like Tyson was back and he was here to reign over the heavyweight division with a rod of iron. And you know what I mean? Like, it was just like his first reign in terms of the way people perceived it. So he then knocked out Bruce Seldon. Then he went into the Holyfield fight. And again, I thought Tyson was going to walk through Holyfield, like most people did. You have to understand, Holyfield had lost several fights by this time. He lost to Riddick Bowe in the first fight, which was a brutal fight. He lost to Riddick Bowe in the third fight as well, where he got stopped by Bowe. Another brutal fight. He lost to Michael Moorer, and Holyfield actually had a health scare, and he had his boxing license revoked because he had some kind of heart problem. You know? So Holyfield was seen as washed up. He came back when he finally got his license back. He came back and he fought Bobby Ches, and he didn't look particularly impressive against Bobby Ches. Tyson was blasting through people, blasted through Bruno, blasted through Seldon. Everybody's scared of this guy again. Holyfield looked like a washed up guy, been inactive, stopped once by Riddick Bowe, but he'd been in several wars, taken a lot of punishment. And normally when Mike Tyson fought little guys, think Michael Spinks. He fought Michael Spinks in 88, I think it was. Michael Spinks, just like Holyfield, came up from light heavyweight. Holyfield started his pro career at light heavyweight, then cruiserweight, then, moved up to heavyweight. So Tyson, when he fought them little guys, he would just walk through them. Did it with Spinks, did it with several other little guys throughout his career. So, yeah, I just thought it was going to be a typical Mike Tyson display of destruction, and so did everybody else. Holyfield was a 25-1 underdog. I know in retrospect, people think it's crazy because Holyfield was a great fighter. But again, you have to understand the public perception at the time. Yeah, the public perception was Holyfield was done. He looked done. Do you know what I mean? Like he looked finished. Look at the way that he just collapsed in that third fight with Riddick Bowe. He looked done. And then the health issues and license taken off him. So when Holyfield won that fight again, it turned the boxing world upside down. It was so shocking. I couldn't believe it. It's like the day after, I was walking around in a daze. Like, did that just happen? I couldn't believe it. But then I didn't learn my lesson, because I should have learned my lesson from the first time Tyson lost, Tyson Douglas, that no fighter is invincible. But, I bought into all the excuses. Then it happened again with Holyfield, and didn't learn my lesson. Then it happened again in the Holyfield rematch, where it became very clear that Tyson just can't beat this guy. But I still didn't learn my lesson. And I was still buying into Roy Jones Jr. and his invincibility. Now, he had a difficult time against Montel Griffin in the first fight, where he ended up getting disqualified. But then he righted the wrong, if you want to call it that, in the rematch, and wiped Montel Griffin out in the first round. And that just reaffirmed my belief that Roy Jones was invincible. I honestly felt the guy used to call himself Superman. He was the Superman before Adonis Stevenson. And I felt like Roy Jones was invincible, particularly after he went up to heavyweight and fought Ruiz. I thought that was crazy when he fought John Ruiz at heavyweight. It was like a freak show type thing, because back then, not that many people were doing catchweight fights anymore. Back in the days, and you go way, way, way back, decades prior, catchweight fights were quite a big thing. And by catchweight, they weren't just talking about the two fighters fighting at a weight in between two weight classes. No, catchweight used to sometimes also refer to when a guy jumps several weight classes and goes and fights somebody in a much higher division. That would sometimes also be referred to as a catchweight fight by some people. So people weren't jumping, from super middleweight or light heavyweight all the way up to heavyweight very often. Yeah, that wasn't something that was happening all the time. Particularly a guy as small as Jones, because Roy Jones was small even for a light heavyweight. This is not a guy who's like a big light heavyweight going up to heavyweight like Michael Spinks. No, Roy Jones wasn't even really a light heavyweight at all. He was more like a middleweight / super middleweight. That was his real weight. And going all the way up to heavyweight to fight John Ruiz and just beating the crap out of Ruiz, hurting him. and schooling him for 12 rounds. And you had Norman Stone in Ruiz's corner going crazy. I just felt like this guy can walk on water. I truly believed in my heart that Roy Jones was unbeatable. You know, me and my brother, my younger brother, we were massive Roy Jones Jr. fans. So he had the fight with Tarver after he came back down from fighting John Ruiz. Came back down from heavyweight to fight John Ruiz. And if you go and watch the fight now, Roy Jones won that first Antonio Tarver fight. He won it. But people were so shocked at seeing Roy Jones in a competitive fight that it was like news around the world in the boxing world. Back then, news was just the boxing magazines. You know, there was no internet or anything back then. Well, I think it existed, but most people didn't have the internet. It wasn't as big as it is now. Most boxing information was still obtained from reading The Ring magazine or KO magazine or Boxing Illustrated or Boxing News or, you know, all them kind of boxing publications. So you'd wait, you know, for your publication and buy it religiously. And in the boxing world, it was just such a shock that somebody was even competitive against Roy Jones. That's how dominant Roy Jones was. Like, you're not used to seeing people even competitive with him. You're not used to seeing people even win a round against this guy. That's what a phenom Roy Jones was. So for Tarver to be competitive, it was a shock to people. You know, and some people said, oh, Tarver really won the fight. He didn't win the fight. If you go back and watch it now, Roy Jones won that fight. But Tarver was competitive. In the rematch, I thought it was going to be... And look, Tarver was a good fighter, right? But he'd lost by the time he fought Roy Jones. I'm sure he'd lost, if memory serves me right, because he certainly was struggling against guys who Roy Jones... Let's have a look at his box rec. Had he lost? I'm sure he'd lost before he fought Jones. Yeah, he lost to Eric Hardin. Yeah, he lost to Eric Hardin. And there was somebody else. Reggie Johnson. These are people who Roy Jones beat easily, comfortably. And Antonio Tarver had lost to Eric Hardin. Now, you know, I saw Antonio Tarver in the Olympics and I was well aware that he had a drug problem even then. But still, I didn't think this guy had anything for Roy Jones in a rematch. I thought that Roy Jones would do to Tarver in the rematch what he did to Montel Griffin when he rematched him. Because, you know, Griffin gave Jones problems in the first fight. And Jones was like, okay, I'll show you the real Roy Jones in a rematch. And he just wiped Montel Griffin out in one round. I thought that's what was going to happen in the Tarver rematch. That's what the press thought. That's what all the press were writing. That Jones is going to turn it on in his rematch and he's going to wipe Antonio Tarver out. You know, he's going to show him what it's really all about. And I think Roy Jones thought the same thing. You know, he came out there with those same intentions. But he got knocked the hell out with one punch. That was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen. And that was the day that I finally learned my lesson. That was the day when I finally learned that there is no such thing as an unbeatable fighter. It doesn't exist. There's a way to beat everybody. And when you are a guy like Mike Tyson, who is out there fighting all comers, if you do that, you're eventually going to lose. Mike Tyson was undisputed champion in the 1980s going through to the very early 1990s. Undisputed champion. Fighting everybody. Eventually, a fringe contender in Buster Douglas got him. You know, got him on the right night, did him in. That's what happens when you're fighting everybody. Somebody's eventually going to get you. The same thing happened with the Holyfield fight. Same thing happened with Roy Jones. Roy Jones was like, he wasn't necessarily fighting everybody, truth be told, but he was going through several different weight classes and he'd fought a lot of good fighters. A hell of a lot of them. And obviously with Roy Jones, he wasn't the most technical fighter. He was more athleticism than technique. And his athleticism was phenomenal. But as he got older and his athleticism started to decline, that's when the holes in his technique started to become more apparent, and fighters like Tarver were able to exploit those holes. You know, he walked Roy Jones onto a tremendous left hand in that rematch. And yeah, down went Roy, and it was over. I was just Again, totally shocked. Walking around in a daze like, did that happen? And as I say, since then, I've never, ever bought into this idea that a fighter is invincible since then. Because again, if you weren't following boxing back then, you really don't understand the aura of invincibility that was around these fighters like Roy Jones and Mike Tyson. You don't understand it because there's nobody around today that has an aura of invincibility even close to a prime Mike Tyson. Not even remotely close, or a prime Roy Jones. Like Tyson, I've talked about this before, people, I'm serious. Mike Tyson's aura of invincibility was like a universal thing. It's like everybody agreed on it. In or out of the ring, nobody's touching this guy in any kind of hand-to-hand combat. It was like, this was a universal thing for years. In movies, people would talk about it on television, on the radio, like in boxing circles and, non-boxing. Everybody knew that Mike Tyson's the baddest man on the planet and you can't beat him. And that's it. It was like a fact. That's the way people perceived it. That's the way I perceived it. So when a guy like that ends up losing, you realize that anybody can lose, So when Mayweather came along, for example, and there was this idea that Mayweather was invincible, I never bought into it. To me, I could see what Mayweather and Hatman were doing, picking the right fights at the right time and, then retiring, quote unquote, to avoid certain fights and then coming back when somebody looked vulnerable enough and all that. And look, Mayweather was a great, great fighter, tremendous fighter. But if he'd done what Sugar Ray Robinson had done or Henry Armstrong had done and literally just fight everybody, Mayweather would have lost. He would have lost. There's no such thing as an invincible fighter. Yeah? He would have taken a lot, just like he did in the amateurs he lost. He would have lost in the pros too. Pros even tougher than the amateurs. 12-round fights. Guys don't have to get you in 3 rounds. They got 12 rounds to get you. So I never bought into that Mayweather's invincible thing. I think he was a very, very good fighter, a great fighter. But there was also a large element of, careful matchmaking and management going on there in order to preserve that unbeaten record. And the same thing today, because there are a lot of Deontay Wilder fans and a lot of Tyson Fury fans who believe both their guys are invincible. A lot of Fury fans say nobody can beat him, it's impossible, and he already beat Wilder and nobody out there can touch him. I don't buy it. I've been here before, people. Been here before with Roy Jones and Mike Tyson and, many other fighters over the years. Been here before. Same thing with Deontay Wilder. I mean, are you kidding me? He's got plenty of holes in his game. If he's out here fighting everybody, I'm telling you, Deontay Wilder's going to lose. He's not going to beat all the top guys in the division. That's not going to happen. He'll probably end up losing to somebody you don't even expect. Like when Foreman lost to Jimmy Young. I mean, when Foreman lost to Ali, it was a shock. But at least Ali had been a great fighter before. At least Ali had beaten Sonny Liston, Foreman's mentor. At least he'd, won the rematch with Joe Frazier and the rematch with Kenny Norton and all that kind of stuff and beating good men. Oscar Bonavena and Jerry Quarry and whoever. At least he'd done that. So even though he was written off against George Foreman, because Foreman wiped out Joe Frazier and Kenny Norton, who both beaten Ali, in other fights, Ali was an underdog, but at least he'd been a great fighter before. But when Foreman lost to Jimmy Young, it's like, wow. Because a lot of people started to believe in foot. Look, I wasn't around watching boxing then, so I'm going off, what the old timers told me and the documentaries I've seen over the years and all this kind of stuff. But Foreman was building up this destroyer reputation again, at least to some extent, although he did look vulnerable in the Ron Lyle fight. That was a hell of a shootout. One of the greatest heavyweight slugfests of all time. But yeah, like Foreman was still seen as a very, very formidable fighter. And for him to lose to Jimmy Young, very surprising. Very, very surprising. So Deontay Wilder, this big puncher who doesn't have the greatest boxing skills, who can lose 6 straight rounds to an old, slow, Cuban who's not even moving his head and he's standing right in front of him. And you're trying to tell me this guy's invincible? What brand of crack are you smoking? Because whatever brand it is, I need to make sure that stays out of my neighborhood. You know? Like, Wilder's a very good fighter, but don't for a second delude yourself into thinking this guy's invincible. There are people in the heavyweight division now who on their night can beat Deontay Wilder. There are people in the heavyweight division right now who on their night could beat Fury. And we've already seen somebody on their night beat AJ. Yeah? There is no such thing as an invincible fighter, people. It doesn't exist. Telling you, it does not exist. It's just a matter of, will he meet the guy in the division during his era that has his number? Because the guy is always there. But will he actually fight him? That's the question. And in this particular heavyweight era, there's a whole heap of talent. Yeah, this ain't like the Klitschko era where it was mainly devoid of talent. And even then, both Klitschko's lost, right? Vitali, I'm not just talking about the Lennox Lewis fight, he quit against Chris Bird. And Vladimir lost to Ross Purity, Corey Sanders, Lamont Brewster. You know what I mean? And that was in a relatively weak era after Lewis retired, relatively weak. And, well, the younger Klitschko, Vladimir, still took a loss after Lewis retired against Lamont Brewster. So, you know, even in a weak era, there can be big upsets. And in a strong era like now, and when I say strong, I'm not saying that the guys around today are as good as the guys in the 90s or as good as the guys in the 70s, because that's impossible to really know. What I'm saying is there's a lot of relatively young, hard-punching, athletically gifted, ambitious, in-shape guys who, you know, want to fight each other and believe in themselves and stuff like that. There's a lot of guys like that in the heavyweight division. And all the guys in the heavyweight division are flawed in some way. You know? And when it's like that, I'm telling you, everybody has a boogeyman, at least one. Everybody has somebody who on their given night could beat them in the heavyweight division. And it is often not who you think it would be. Yeah? With Fury and Wilder, what I'm telling you is it's not just Fury and Wilder who can beat each other. I'm saying there's people outside of Fury and Wilder who could beat Fury and Wilder. Yeah? And if they actually fight everybody, you might find out that I'm right. You know? It will happen. So, anyway, the moral of the story is there's no such thing as an invincible fighter. I learned that lesson a long, long time ago, which is why things like AJ Ruiz, you know, Ruiz beating AJ, it didn't shock me. Because I've already been through this. I've already been here. I've already seen fans, and I've been a fan myself who bought into the idea that Mike Tyson was invincible or Roy Jones was invincible. I've already been there. You know what I mean? I mean, when Nigel Benn beat Gerald McClellan, that was a big upset. You know? Nigel Benn, like all of the British press picked Nigel Benn to lose. There were several British press who were picking Nigel Benn to get knocked out in one round by Gerald McClellan. And Nigel Benn turned the odds on their heads and he did his thing, you know? So I've lived through a lot of upsets over the years, people. I mean, I remember when David Tua lost to Ike Ibeabuchi. Ike Ibeabuchi, get him up for you here, people. Ike Ibeabuchi was a Nigerian heavyweight who really came out of obscurity when he fought David Tua. David Tua was being groomed and being marketed by HBO as like the heir apparent to Mike Tyson. He was like, you know, a cross between Mike Tyson and Joe Frazier. That's the way HBO were trying to build him up. And he looked like a cross between Mike Tyson and Joe Frazier in some of his early fights. Like when he knocked out John Ruiz in like 19 seconds, that was one of the most devastating knockouts you will ever see. Anybody who hasn't seen David Tua versus John Ruiz, go watch it. Because you will be hard pressed to find a more devastating knockout than that. Devastating. When he knocked out John Ruiz. Poor John Ruiz. Didn't know what hit him. So he looked devastated in that fight, David Tua. He also fought a guy called Darrell Wilson. Darrell Wilson was the guy who gave Shannon Briggs his first career loss. He stopped Shannon Briggs. I think it was it 4 rounds he stopped Briggs in? That was shocking as well. That was an upset at the time. because Briggs was being built up as like the heavyweight Roy Jones, you know? And for him to lose to Darryl Wilson was a big shock at the time. So, yeah, two of them was matched with Wilson, you know, the guy who's just knocked off this great New York heavyweight prospect. Tua went in there with Wilson, and Wilson was said to have a really good chin. But Tua knocked him out in 1 round. You know, Tua was steaming through people in some of his early fights. Then he fought a couple guys who gave him more rounds. You know, he fought like David Izon, who was actually quite a tough fight until Tua stopped him in the last round. Then he went in there with Ike Ibeabuchi. In fact, I can't remember if the Maskayev and Hasim Ratman fights were before or after Tua fought Ibeabuchi. I think they were before. Or am I wrong? Did he fight Ratman the first time after he fought Ibeabuchi or before? I'm pretty sure it was before. Anyway, I'll check in just a second. Point I'm making is all the talk was about David Tua. All right? Ike Ibeabuchi was brought in as an opponent for David Tua. He wasn't brought in as like a 50-50. He wasn't brought in as, somebody who might potentially beat Tua. He was brought in as a guy who was going to give Tua rounds, some obscure African heavyweight. And back then, there were not many African heavyweights. It's not like today where, there's loads of African heavyweight. Back then, it was very rare to find a heavyweight with an African name. There was a couple like Ibeabuchi, Akinwande, David Izomrite, but, compared to now, there was nowhere near as many. Because, of course, now, Anthony Joshua, and when I say African, I'm talking about somebody who has, if they're not born in Africa, they've got African parents, right? There are loads of heavyweights out there now like that. But back then, not so much. Ibeabuchi was plucked from obscurity and really beaten nobody of note. And he went in there and it was a tremendous fight with David Tua. It wasn't a one-sided fight at all. But he was a revelation. Like this guy that nobody had even considered as, being a future heavyweight champion. Literally plucked from obscurity. And overnight, this guy is like being talked about as a future heavyweight champion. Mike Tyson, in an interview once, said that out of all the young heavyweights coming up, and this was when Tyson was still fighting. This was after the Holyfield fights. And he said, of all the young heavyweights coming up, the only one who he thinks will be a problem is Ike Ibeabuchi. And that's high praise coming from, the baddest man on the planet. He said, Ike Ibeabuchi could be a problem. So, this can happen. Fighters can spring up out of nowhere, like really good fighters. And that's what was the case with Ike Ibeabuchi. So his early career, he's fighting people like Greg Pickram and just random journeymen. Marion Wilson was a well-known trial horse back in those days. Marion Wilson. So he's just, trundling through fighting people you never heard of for the most part, or, a couple journeymen that I do know. In fact, let me have a look at some of these journeymen, see if I can remember some of their names. Calvin Lampkin. I know Jeff Lampkin, the former cruiserweight champion. Not sure who Calvin Lampkin was. Greg Pickram, I saw him fight several times. Gary Butts, I don't know any of these guys. Anthony Wade, I've seen him fight a few times, journeyman. Calvin Jones, that name kind of rings a bell, but I can't. Marion Wilson, I definitely know. Marcus Gonzalez, see, most of them are just journeymen, people we never heard of. Then he goes in with David Tua, who was on the brink of, challenging for world titles and being built up as a serious heavyweight prospect, 27-0, goes and beats David Tua. They ended up beating Chris Bird, took Chris Bird's unbeaten record. That was a really impressive performance, actually, against Chris Bird. Everton Davis, I remember Everton Davis as well. Anyway, moral of the story is, I'm not buying into the myth of the unbeaten fighter again. I haven't bought into that since Jones got knocked out by Tarver all those years ago, and I'm not going to buy into it again. I've learned my lesson. And I'm sure there's a lot of boxing fans out there who haven't learned that lesson yet because they haven't lived through all the different upsets I've lived through. But if you follow boxing for long enough, you too will learn not to believe the myth of the invincible boxer. So with that being said, let me bring this to an end. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. It's Hatman, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week. covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.